Welcome to Art Toronto and welcome to Corking Gallery Special Projects at Art Toronto. I'm delighted to have two very special people with me today. Thaddeus Holownia, who came in from New Brunswick to talk about his work, his new body of work, Of a Feather, with Paul Roth, who's the director of the Image Center at Metropolitan University. Thank you both for being here.
Yeah,
I'm delighted for you to be doing this talk. And please, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for inviting me Actually, I'm meeting Thaddeus today, which is great. So I feel like I've been invited to meet Thaddeus, which is lovely. And thank you all for being here. It's really nice to see you in such a casual setting and at our art fair. I'm sure a lot of you, I'm still dealing with the shock of seeing so many people at one time after 2.5 years of not seeing so many people at all. So it makes it even more special. Some of you will certainly know about Thaddeus. Some of you may not know so much about him. But I have to tell you a little bit about my experience because I think of myself in relation to his work as still being a bit of an enthusiast and an amateur rather than an expert. To me, that's the most special moment of discovery of an artist's work. And I'm still in it, even though I first heard about Thaddeus's work a very long time ago. I'm from the United States, and I first understood that he was an important artist in Canada from reading about him and taking note of his unusual name. To me, it was unusual. In the pages of the Canadian magazines that I looked at, Black Flash, and most importantly, Border Crossings. And I'm really happy that the editors and publishers of Border Crossings are here with us today because it's in your pages that I first saw his work. And he was among a handful of artists that I knew about from my position in Washington, D.C., where I spent most of my career. When I moved to Canada 9 years ago to begin working at the Image Center, which is a photography museum here in Toronto, I started to learn more about the artists that I had only known before as names or as reproductions in magazines. And for me, it continues to be an incredibly exciting thing because I'm always humbled by the extraordinary careers of artists like Thaddeus, like Max Dean, another person who I knew only by name, and by others, Vera Frankel, and I could go on and on. And over the years, I've really started to learn about his work in person because of Jane Corkin. Jane was showing me Thaddeus's work during my visits to the gallery, and I was especially moved by the fact that Jane has represented his work since 1979. And that long relationship, which is very unusual in our field, is the kind of thing that hooks me. I'm very romantic by nature, and that level of knowledge and warmth and attachment between a dealer and an artist that would last so long is very, very powerful to me, and it makes me want to know more. And Jane helped me to know more. So there's too much to say about Thaddeus and his work. You can, if you want, see a lot of his work on the screen. We're here to talk about this body of work, but let it suffice to say that Thaddeus has a 40 to 45 year, 50 year maybe even, I'm sorry, career making photographs of all kinds. He's quite versatile, though I think he's predominantly known for two things: his work on various subjects of nature, which he approaches, I'll try to keep my characterizations to a minimum. I don't want to pigeonhole him, but he's essentially an Emersonian, and he's really interested in quiet and overlooked aspects of nature. He's also very well known for a camera that he uses a lot, which is a very unusual panoramic camera that gives a very wide field view and which is incredibly challenging to use to make good images with because it is so demanding of the viewer, and yet Thaddeus's pictures are not demanding. They're incredibly graphic and gripping, and they avoid stylization and effects. They really allow you to look at the world as we live in the world, to scan what you see. He's had many subjects that he's approached again and again, including a beautiful pond that's, I think, just in your backyard, called Jolicoeur Pond, a bridge that has been missing since you began photographing it, since before you began photographing it, called Rockland Bridge. And those bodies of work, I think, are especially special if you want to look further into Thaddeus's work. They are sequences of images made over time of the shifts and changes of season, of light and color, in particular, very quiet environments, and they really reward repeated looking. And he made those bodies of work over time, and there's, of course, a great quality that comes from looking at bodies of work over time. The body of work that we'll be looking at today is also a continuation of an engagement with the subject. And I think it's really important to set the context before we talk about these images. These pictures are in many ways an engagement between Thaddeus and his wife. And I have to say up front, his wife passed away a year and a half ago. So this is a very emotional body of work that follows on two other quite emotional bodies of work that are very personal and that are the fruition of his long relationship with his wife, who was an ornithologist and whom he met very cute when he moved from Toronto back in the 1970s to New Brunswick. He met her very early in his, at the beginning of his tenure as a professor at Mount Allison University, when he found a beautiful carcass of a bird, and then decided that it was much too beautiful to walk by, much too beautiful to leave. And so he picked it up, and not really knowing what he was doing exactly, he walked found the biology department, carried it to somebody and said, "This bird is so beautiful. I think that, you should have this, you should keep this." And he was then introduced to the ornithologist, who then became his partner. And from that relationship, I have to tell you, you can trace a 45-year line to today, because that bird's carcass is this picture right here. So I think it's important to know that context, and also to know that it's not only personal. There's also a political dimension to this work, which I think is key to know. And it does fit very much into the aesthetic of Thaddeus's work in ways that we'll try to extrapolate for you, even though that may not be evident. You may look at this body of work, look at the images that you see going by here, and you may wonder, well, how does this connect to all of the work that has come before? Setting this specific context, I want to show you these two books. These are two separate bodies of work that led to this one, and I don't know if you'd call it a trilogy, because you may not be done doing it, but they are connected.
Yeah, and it will be a trilogy when the book comes out.
Right. That's the other thing. There is a book yet to come that will be very much like these two, perhaps in format, certainly in that you are collaborating for the third time with the same writer, the same poet. Yeah. And this body of work is a series of photographs of bird eggs, right, that were collected by the ornithology lab that is now named after your wife. Yeah. And these photographs were made with her. In other words, you collaborated on the making of the images. This second body of work, which is quite an extraordinary story, Icarus Falling of Birds, was also made with your wife. And do you mind telling a bit the story? Or maybe I should just read the poem and then we can...
Maybe I'll set the context. Very tragically, in 2013, there was a disastrous bird kill in St. John, New Brunswick, where the liquid LNG plant, liquid natural gas plant in St. John, was flaring off excess gases in the fall during migration, during low cloud cover, and 10,000 birds were killed in one evening. I think that's a very modest number. I'm sure there were many more killed. I learned of it because my partner, Gay Henson, was one of the ornithologists that was called out to go and identify those birds. Some looked like they were sleeping, some were burnt to a crisp and were unidentifiable. Obviously, very, very hard thing to do, but it had to be done because the birds were in evidence when the Irvings were charged with Migratory Bird Act, killing songbirds and endangered birds. At any rate, 2 years passed before Harry Thurston and I were able to go to the New Brunswick Museum and look at the what was there, which was garbage bags full of frozen birds, to work on a project that we felt was necessary in terms of memorializing the incident, I guess I would say. Something to say, you know what, this is not going to be a page 3 story next week. We need to do something that will keep this story and teach people and keep people conscious of that, because it's not an isolated incident. We went, I photographed 300 birds, and Harry kept meticulous notes. The book, Icarus Falling of Birds, is really a chronicle through a long poem of that event. And Paul thought he would read one of the poems, and I think that's very appropriate. So,
we move for love, for curiosity, for commerce. We move while sea level rises. We move while wildfire rages. We move while the sea ice grows ever thinner and ice shelves shatter. We move while the glaciers retreat and coral reefs bleach. We keep moving while the oceans acidify and the temperature ticks higher. We move constantly between the poles of necessity and desire as the birds migrate between their burnt and clear-cut forests, headlong into our mountain towers, transmitting soap operas and reality shows, our twittering banalities, while the skyscrapers burn all night, and in the morning the birds lie on the plazas and the pavements, inert as the homeless. It's just a small portion of the book-length poem that was written by Harry Thurston in collaboration with Thaddeus. And I think it's important for anybody who looks at this work, not only to know about the context of these previous bodies of work, but also to know about the collaboration, that they really are an effort to think with a writer about how it is that that something, whether it's political, whether it's personal, that is an attachment between our lives and the lives around us and the nature around us, how it is that that continues or is threatened and endangered. And this body of work is not the same as this one. This one is quite different formally, and I think it's a really interesting indication of Thaddeus's range as an artist. This one was actually an enormously long single scroll of photographic paper that showed the birds falling in a cylinder shape almost, hanging from above. How long is the piece?
It's a 17-foot high, 30-inch wide photograph of 200 birds, all head down, and I did it for an exhibition at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, and they gave me a big wall, and they said, if you'd like to create a work just for that particular, it was a show called The Nature of Nature, and the book was coming out at the same time, so I just took the opportunity to do something different and to confront people with the scale of what happens when 200 birds are falling from the sky. And I kept the birds pretty close to the same scale as they were. And so it's really a scroll, is the way I saw it. Yeah.
And this body of work that we're looking at here displayed, I think, for the first time, this body of work is quite different, but obviously related. And I mentioned to you already that one of these birds that you see here is actually the bird whereby you met your partner. And then all of these other birds are birds that were in the collection of this ornithology facility, which he built.
Yes. These works come from my long-time relationship teaching at Mount Allison University, where I met my partner and where she also taught in the biology department. And when we traveled together, I would travel with a view camera and she would travel with a dissecting kit. And we did a cross-country tour once, and we would be traveling and I would be photographing and we would be picking up roadkill. And so at night I'd develop film and Gay would do study skins. And so after she passed away, the university recognized the extraordinary collection that she had built up. Not because they paid her to build it up, but because she had a love for wanting to preserve things. And so there's a Gay Hansen ornithology lab that has a lot of mounted birds, because she was a very skilled taxidermist. There are probably 1,000 study skins, which are like sleeping birds. Probably a lot of you have seen drawers of birds. That a lot of people go to museums and they photograph drawers of birds. Well, that's essentially what is at the Gay Hansen Ornithology Lab, or 6 or 7 cabinets of many drawers of birds. And they're preserved in a way that students can learn about scale, plumage, all things to do with anatomy of birds, but they don't take up the same space as mounted birds do. And so, as I guess part of my grieving process, I went to the lab over the winter and made photographs. And the university was very accommodating, because they knew that I knew my way around the lab, and just gave me the keys to the cabinets. And they're all photographs, close-ups of birds, feathers, mostly of breast area, and photographed with natural light, because there's a beautiful window in this really old building, and I just set up a little copy stand there. And I was telling Paul that they're 15-second exposures, because when I was photographing them, at first I did them and they looked really sharp, and I didn't like that. They just didn't seem to have the kind of, they didn't exude a life somehow when they became these flattened photographs. So they're not out of focus, but they're just a little softer because of that kind of camera vibration. So
yeah. I have to say, the softness of them, which was one of the first things I wondered at when I saw them, is actually, for me, what takes these images from being what you might have thought of them when you first saw them, which is that they're beautiful and that they're abstract close-up images of birds. From the first moment that I saw them, I thought, no, there's something more there, and I wondered what it was. And when Jane first told me a little bit about why they were made, and then this morning when Thaddeus told me more, I started to understand that my connection to these images is maybe almost as personal as Thaddeus's. It can't be as personal, of course, but one thing I have in common with Thaddeus is my own long relationship with my wife. And these kinds of connections that make us understand what it is that really matters to us, and the means by which we memorialize our own relationships, even when they pass. And the fact that these are post-mortem images, that these are images of death and repose, make them much more than beautiful pictures. And I think it's wonderful that they can be shown this way, and that we can talk about this so that you can see that there's so much more behind images than we imagine when we first see them. And for me, this morning, I have to say, just talking to Thaddeus before we came out here, that final piece of the puzzle came for me about why it is that I love them so much. I hope that you also like these images, and I hope that you find a place for your own experience in Thaddeus's experience and in these images. Thank you very much.
For me, I mean, there's owls and pheasants, and that's important to me on a certain level. But there aren't any labels that are telling you that. So I think it's like many bodies of my work. This one just happened to take a lot shorter time to resolve. There's an accumulation of information that happens from making a work, putting it up in the studio, living with it, going back and reinvestigating it. So whether I work in Newfoundland or whatever, the Rockland Bridge took 20 years to photograph. The experience of this and the pleasure, and I thank Jane and the Corkin Gallery for presenting it in such an extraordinary way, is that you want people to see this, or any artist wants their work to be shown in the most appropriate public way that it can be. And for me, this is it. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing, and I know people will buy some work and take it home. But when you work on something, I guess you get a chance to do this every once in a while, that people will come in and see the holistic point of view. And
will you talk about, you have so many projects that span sometimes 4 years, 5 years, even 12 years or 15 years. Will you just talk a little about your practice and how you approach your practice? For example, people know the Walden Project because as an environmentalist, you deeply feel Thoreau's time in the woods and how he approached his writings. And I think for your work, it's well engaged in that philosophy. And so I think time is important. Will you talk a little about that, please?
Sure. So I was lucky. I was a person who never had a job. I went to Mount Allison to teach, and it fit me, and people let me do whatever I wanted to do, and I did it well, I think, because they kept me there for 41 years. So my work as an artist was subsidized by my profession at the institution, and I'm proud that I didn't squander it. So if I did work on a project for 10 years, the 10 years accumulation of that was part and parcel of the work itself. And so I was lucky I didn't have to work on a timeline. I wasn't a commercial photographer, so I didn't work to a deadline. I found writers who I had a close relationship, Harry Thurston, Douglas Lockheed, Peter Sanger, who I could take an idea and further it by working with the idea of the book. And the book, to me, was this democratic object that allowed me to further spread an idea beyond the gallery walls. And so some things take a lot of time. Some things go on forever and people shake their heads. But, I live in the Tantramar Marshes. Do I still photograph the Tantramar Marshes even though I've had many exhibitions? Sure I do, because it changes and it's extraordinary. And I still have something that bewilders me and excites me when I wake up in the day and go out and...
What is that?
What is that?
Talk about the Tantramar Marshes.
Well, it's a flat hayfield that most people drive through going from Quebec through New Brunswick to Nova Scotia. But if you don't slow down and have a look at it, right? What's this? This is just a bunch of feathers. But if you slow down and you go home today and you see a blue jay in your backyard, you're going to look at it very differently, hopefully, if you allow yourself to. I went to Walden Pond. I was challenged there by this very small piece of real estate that was overrun by people 6 months of the year, and then it was desolate the other 6 months of the year because the tourist season was over. And in the end, after going there and bouncing around through the forest, I made 24 portraits of 24 trees that spoke to me in a way that I think meticulously Thoreau would have gone in the woods and looked at those trees. Maybe not the same trees, but maybe some of the same trees. But I was engaging with the nature of that place in a way that's universal and timeless. And I think that any great artwork has to occupy that space, I think. And it doesn't have to be complicated and doesn't have to have a language around it. It just has to have solidity. Yeah, it has to come from an emotional place that anyone can then occupy.
And if I can add to that, there's something about duration and time, which is, of course, intrinsic to photography, and which anyone who is as seasoned a thinker and practitioner as Thaddeus, not only as a photographer and an artist, but as a teacher, can tell you that aspect of duration is really critical. Time is always slowing down, and time is always passing when you look at and think about photographs. And when you make a photograph, to some extent, you're freezing time, but you're also making it last so that a moment of looking can happen again and again and again. And even these images, which, of course, you mentioned what to a photographer is a really long duration of time to make an image, 15 seconds, though it's also just 15 seconds, which is basically nothing, a blink of the eye in life. And the images, the project was done over how many days?
6 months.
6 months, not very long by your standards. No. However, these birds were collected across the arc of a relationship. And that one was, 40-something years ago, and is a blue jay. And I don't know, you didn't say anything to me about this, but I wonder if you were especially aware of that because you were coming from Toronto. And you saw this blue jay, and here you were in New Brunswick, and you handed it off. And it even traces your own passage in that sort of meaningless metaphorical way over 45 years. I feel like that is what photography does by nature. So whether you're actually looking at change over time, you're really just aggregating images. As you said, Jolicoeur Pond is literally off your back deck that you make those images. But you do it again and again and again with the persistence of vision and looking that then allows us to see something that we otherwise wouldn't see. Marcia, as you mentioned, I am the ultimate criminal in the underappreciation of wetlands. I am the kind of person that drives through a marsh and thinks that it's just plain and not interesting, and I pass through. But through your images, I can look at them and I can see something that I didn't otherwise notice.
I'll plug a CBC program that I had a very, very minor part in. It was on Ideas, I think last week or the week before, and the title is Wetlands, and then it has a subtitle, and it's an incredible hour-long piece on the importance of wetlands around the world, and everyone should hear it. It's amazing.
I think what you both have in common is that you have mentored so many people, and you work in universities which are so important in keeping alive the arts in this country.
Well, thank you. Thank you.